Okay, so I first visited the Prado, which is where you can see most of Goya's work, in Madrid in 2006. Whilst I was still an art student at Edinburgh. I was also lucky enough to go back to Madrid just right at the beginning of the year, this year. So these works are quite fresh in my mind. But back in 2006, after 4.5 hours in the Prado, I finally reached the work of Goya. Yet I was a little weary, and I remember looking at this painting, his El Quita Sol, the Parasol, from 1777. Although clearly a beautiful painting, I did not look at it for long or with much interest and carried on into the adjoining rooms where I was confronted by Goya's black paintings. What had happened? How did an artist go from painting works like this to works like this? During the course of this lecture, I hope to answer this question by examining Goya's influences and how the context of his time had a startling effect on his work. How did he arrive at such an image, and for what purpose? Goya was born in 1746. His career saw him study in Zaragoza and the Royal Academy of Arts in Madrid under Anton Raphael Monge. Carlos III of Spain had brought Monge over from Naples to run artistic affairs in Madrid in 1761. Monge championed neoclassical art in the Italian tradition. This is Touch Me Not, his painting from 1771. It recalls the aesthetic of antiquity, which the Renaissance had returned to 3 centuries earlier, evident in the drapery and smooth idealized figures of Christ and Mary Magdalene. Carlos III tended to judge all culture in relation to Italian and French standards rather than Spanish. He had also requested the aging Italian artist Tiepolo travel to Madrid and create a fresco to decorate the Royal Palace of Madrid, called the Apotheosis of Spain, from 1762 to 66. Tiepolo was famous for his elaborate decorative style, popular at the beginning half of the 18th century, but now making way for the new classical tastes championed by Monge. This is his painting, St. Peter Enthroned, from 1776. Although Spain had produced great artists in the past, such as Velázquez, Ribera, and Zurbarán, there was no longer a current authoritative Spanish school. To have any kind of successful artistic career at the Bourbon court, you had to either be Italian or know how to imitate the Italian style. So around 1770, Goya left for Rome to continue his studies. France was also influential on 18th century Spanish art, and from the time of Louis XIV was responsible for a more ornate and playful style known as Rococo. This movement was defined through its dainty color and delicate decoration. It described light-hearted and frivolous scenes, such as Fragonard's The Swing, also more humorously known as The Happy Accidents of the Swing, painted in 1767 and permanently on display at the Wallace Collection in London. Here we see a young woman being pushed by her elderly husband. She flicks off her shoe in glee, flashing a glimpse of her undergarments to the young man, who takes an excited gasp at this titillating encounter. By 1775, Goya had returned to Madrid, aged 29, and begun to work on cartoons for tapestries for the Bourbon court's new palace outside of Madrid. The tapestries were designed to give light relief from the tedium of court and contained colourful theatrical scenes bathed in warm light, such as this one. This is Goya's The Kite from 1778. Goya's images show only the lower classes at play. They are idealised and airbrushed to portray a picturesque poverty that the royal audience could enjoy. The royal family and their guests could take amusement in the drunken follies and coarse states of undress in which such stereotypes, such as these, this is The Age from 1786, would find themselves. The royal class would never have to encounter the harsh reality of life for the lower classes. Later tapestry designs, like The Wedding by Goya in 1791-2, have more of an edge. The character of the husband, in the center in red, is verging on the grotesque. He is slow, unimpressive, his clothes are out of date, yet he has made his fortune and so claims his beautiful young bride, who walks ahead, eyes downcast, avoiding the gaze of the woman. Their slight smiles hard to read. Perhaps they are simultaneously jealous of the young bride's newfound security, yet extremely relieved they do not have to share a bed with such a brute. By 1789, Goya had fulfilled his ambition to become court painter to the new King Carlos IV. He also taught at the Royal Academy of Arts in Madrid, where in contrast to his earlier teacher Mongs, he expressed his frustration towards critics who placed the perfection of Greek statues above the study of nature. In 1792, Goya wrote a report to the Academy outlining his objection to the teaching of art by the rules of geometry and perspective, used to produce the neoclassical painting currently in fashion. It made no sense to him that the process of painting should adhere to a specific curriculum to be followed by students. I quote, "I do not see any other means of advancing the arts, nor do I believe there is one, than to reward and protect he who excels in them, to hold in esteem the true artist, to allow free rein to the genius of students who wish to learn without oppression or imposition of methods that twist the inclination they show to this or that style of painting." Goya's success was down to his invention and confidence to follow his own ideas, rather than solely rely on a well-rehearsed and accepted doctrine that would guarantee a certain level of success and acceptance. Goya's courage and confidence illustrates his strength as an artist. His willingness to experiment with the experience of life, rather than smooth and idealize, is what distinguished him from his contemporaries, like French painter Jacques-Louis David. This is his Death of Socrates from 1787, which looks back to Greek and Roman grandeur upon a stilted stage of sculpted classical figures. In 1792, at the age of 46, Goya suffered an illness that left him completely deaf for the rest of his life. During the next few years, while still working on official portraits and commissions, Goya began to make his first truly original work, Los Capricios, meaning a whim or fleeting fancy. Published in 1799, Los Capricios is a series of 80 etched prints, presented in a bound folio. It begins with this, an image of the artist, titled Francisco Goya Lucientes, Painter. With his head perpendicular to his gaze, he appears as a discreet observer, and the evidence of this appears on the pages that follow. Generally speaking, Los Capricios are an illustrated exposé of the follies, errors, and common prejudices that afflicted Spanish society at the end of the 18th century. Even though they appear unlabeled and disguised, the ideas and interests expressed are dangerously critical. In order to illustrate a prejudice or folly, you have to recognize it as so, therefore revealing your political position as critical commentator. This is, they say yes and give their hand to the first comma. Here we see the theme of marriage for self-interest, as early observed in the wedding. A topic often revisited by Goya and much discussed by the intellectuals of the day. A beautiful young girl is given away by her father, who stands to her left, to the grinning buck-toothed man following her closely behind. She is not a naive victim. She is smiling and wears a mask over her face to tell us this is a social pantomime, a masquerade, and that she will not make her new husband happy for very long. She appears two-faced. Another grotesque mask appears behind her head, mocking her husband-to-be. And his house is on fire, plate 18, shows an old man staggering about in a drunken state of undress. One arm is in his jacket, his trousers are open wide, and his sock has peeled down, revealing the white of his shin that mirrors the flames that are unnoticed and about to take hold. The differences in tone are achieved by using aquatint, a new technique mastered by Goya that uses powdered rosin, which is acid resistant and applied in varying levels before the plate is dipped in acid, achieving variety in tone. All Will Fall, plate 19, is one example of many images that comment on sexual transaction. Men fall for the charms of women with horrific and disturbing consequences. They are drawn in by the buxom bird and are then collected, plucked, and spiked. The following plate, there they go, plucked, shows the prostitutes and the Celestinas ushering the foolish men out in preparation for the next lot. Why hide them? Plate 30 targets the church and its attempt to conceal its greed. A priest tightly clutches his bags of money, the nature of their worth perhaps hinted at by their crude resemblance to testicles. Until Death, plate 55, explores the themes of vanity. The young woman stifles her laughter as the two valets smirk and roll their eyes at the attention the old crone pays to her perceived beauty, which has long since dissolved with age. They may laugh, but one day they too will be afflicted by the ills of old age. The sleep of reason engenders nightmares. Plate 43 marks a shift in the series. The following images are more fantastical and hard to read. We can all relate to the earlier themes of jealousy, lust, seduction, humiliation, inequalities of class, self-indulgence, and drunkenness. We may also have experienced unease or outrage at the power of organized religion, and our feelings towards these themes are probably not that different from Goya's contemporary audiences. However, the Los Capricios that take witches and goblins as their subjects are far less accessible to today's audience. In 1799, Spain was a country that was still highly superstitious. People still believed an old woman was capable of causing abortions and laying eggs with prophetic designs on them, the crime for which the last woman was burned in 1791 by the Inquisition. It is not necessarily the case that Goya believed in witchcraft, but these later plates imply he knew the potential power the image of the witch had upon the Spanish imagination. This is Blow, plate 69. What One Does to Another, plate 77. And No One Has Seen Us, plate 79. In relation to the earlier Rococo, neoclassical and light-hearted tapestry paintings, it is hard to get a handle on these images. The order and captions give little clarification. They appear as a visual stream of subconsciousness. Invention is no longer a conscious process controlled by the artist or governed by rules. Goya has allowed his imagination to blur with experience and belief in order to produce these highly original images. But they cannot have come from nowhere. Who was Goya looking at? What were his influences, and where did he get the confidence to reproduce such critical images of the inhabitants of a country where such freedom of expression was brutally policed by the Inquisition? It may be that Goya's model for Los Capricios was based on the example of the English. This is James Gillray's monstrous claws at the New Coalition Feast from 1787. It depicts the British royal family. King George III appears on the right, the Queen is on the left, and their son, the Prince of Wales, is seated in the middle. He was known as a glutton, spendthrift, womanizer, liar, and furthermore, accumulated an enormous debt. A craw is the throat or stomach of an animal like a pelican, and here it is used to illustrate the mutual and insatiable greed of the royal family. The king and queen's penny-pinching ways are implied through their bulging craws, and the spendthrift nature of the prince is shown through his bottomless craw. This and other English prints popular in the 18th century symbolize the country's freedom of expression. A historian visiting London in 1788 remarked, "It is necessary to count among the privileges of this country the liberty to make satirical prints that ridicule the enemies of the moment." England was largely uncensored, unlike neighbouring Catholic countries of France and Spain. Yet here English satirical prints were very popular because they attacked, in a typical British, self-depreciating style, the customs of the English, the traditional rival of France and Spain. London contained shops of caricatures that foreign visitors could purchase, and although there is no record of Goya owning copies, many of his friends did. This is The Print Shop Window by James Gilray from 1821. Volumes of caricatures could also be rented out, similarly like a film today or 20 years ago. One contemporary of the time described how they were the unfailing resource for the entertainment of guests in large country houses, drawing out even the shy ones who became social over a portfolio of ludicrous scenes in which celebrated personages have acted with more or less success. The Countess of Merlin, a member of Goya's social circle in Madrid, described how Goya also indulged dinner party guests in the delightful practice of making excellent caricatures, and also recalled that often our table was the theatre on which he exercised his malice. Here we see a caricature of Goya by himself, included at the end of a letter to a friend. It is likely that Los Capricios were intended as a vehicle for conversation. However, those looking to be amused by the same light and titillating entertainment found in English caricatures would have been in for a nasty surprise. In order to understand the originality of Los Capricios, it is useful to consider how they compare to the English caricatures. William Hogarth was perhaps London's first celebrated caricaturist, and his prints were widely circulated in Europe. This is an engraving of the tavern scene from A Rake's Progress from 1735. It is the third scene in the series that sees Tom Rakewell go from rags to riches to the asylum. The prostitutes, with black spots on their faces to cover syphilitic sores, take advantage of the drunken Rakewell as they lift a watch from his pocket. Paintings of all eight of A Rake's Progress can be seen in the John Soane Museum in London one day in the future. English printmakers either invented specific characters to experience their stage folly, such as Hogarth's Tom Rakewell, or were specific in their references, such as Thomas Rowlandson's Britannia Rouse from 1784. Here the figure of Britannia is violently seizing Charles James Fox and Lord North, the leaders of the coalition party in government in 1783. Goya understood the significant potential for the viewer to fill in blank iconography present in his political caricature. It is widely thought that many of Goya's prints, including this one, To Rise and to Fall, refer to Manuel Godoy, Prime Minister and favourite to the King and Queen. Rumours were rife that Godoy's position of power was due to an affair with the Spanish Queen, Maria Luisa. The central figure, dressed in a military tunic, clutches smoking thunderbolts. His enemies have been dethroned as they topple into space. His head looks as if it is about to explode, shooting him off into the atmosphere, but he is grounded by the satyr, a perennial symbol of lust, who holds on tightly to his feet. The ambiguity of Goya's work makes it eternally relevant and universal, as the caption "to rise and to fall" implies. Goya is saying that those who reach the top echelons of political power are inevitably corrupt. Their path to power is sordid, deceptive, and manipulative. It is guided by greed and arrogance, and one wonders if things are so much different today. Goya turns jovial satire on its head. The shamefaced one sees a man's face transformed into genitalia. His scenes are much darker and more serious in their connotations. You might begin laughing at what you think is being ridiculed, but you then become increasingly uncomfortable, self-conscious, and even ashamed at your initial amusement in extremely dark themes. Hogarth and Rowlandson let us laugh freely. We can enjoy the follies of others without being implicated. It is clear who is being ridiculed and for what reason. Certain scenarios formed part of the caricaturist's international language, and by the end of the 18th century, the setting of a barber's shop or the act of shaving was an established theme. This is Thomas Rowlandson's A Barber. The motif's popularity largely stemmed from the fact it placed its subject in a vulnerable position. Here, the barber almost slices his client's nose off, distracted by the newspaper on his lap. A more titillating interpretation is The Female Shaver from 1773. a scenario still popular today, as seen in the recent James Bond film, Skyfall. However, Goya reinterprets this in a much more disturbing manner. In She Fleeces Him, the man's vulnerability is multiplied. He wears a frilled skirt-like garment, and the act of being shaved also seems to imply emasculation, as the strong, tall woman glares down at him, her legs astride. This certainly is being able to read. We are seen to not be just a casual observer looking for something to amuse us. We are warned not to laugh too hard, if at all, for fear of sharing the humour of the demented valet and strange barber who looks as if he's making it up as he goes along. Whereas Hogarth's prints read like stories, Goya's read like poems. They are more mysterious and do not have a clear moral message. Goya's understanding of exposure is more psychologically complex. In Now They Are Sitting Well, the woman seated on the right appears vulnerable. She looks up to the woman who stands looking content, wearing a soft smile. She is either too ignorant to realize her humiliation, or has recognized that it now places her in a position of power. She is free to manipulate others, having suffered the experience of exposure. If you begin to laugh at someone who has just fallen in a puddle of mud, you soon realize that your enjoyment in their misadventure makes you vulnerable to the same fate. The exposed are now in a position of power. They have already fallen, whereas you have not. However, this possible psychological reading does not explain the strangeness of this image. Why do the women have chairs on their heads and skirts around their necks? Another motif used in caricature was the clyster, a large medical syringe seen here in Thomas Rowlandson's Mercury and His Advocates Defeated from 1789. Here, opponents to Mr. Swainson's vegetable cure attack him armed with various medical apparatus, including a clyster. In Goya's own adaptation of the motif, Swallow It Dog, the clyster is again used as a weapon, this time employed by the clergy, who force the faithful to accept every ludicrous doctrine they deliver. But this is a truly disturbing image. We're not laughing. It's as though someone has taken the joke too far, and the room that was full of laughter is suddenly replaced by a stunned silence. Hogarth and those that followed produced titillating images that might lead the viewer to recognize a side of them they would rather not acknowledge. But in essence, the characters are funny and unthreatening in their flaws. In comparison, Goya's characters are terrifying. They are not specific persons and cannot be comfortably mocked in the knowledge they do not refer to yourself or your own personal flaws. One does not laugh for fear of resembling them. Los Capricios is not only critical towards vice, it also criticizes the hypocritical ridicule of it. Although Goya invites his audience to laugh at others, he does not let them enjoy the experience by ridiculing the act of ridicule itself. Goya's use of caricature as mode of expression is not modern. It is his ability to see human nature for what it is that stands him apart. The graphic medium previously reserved for frivolity is used to expose our greatest flaws and faults: greed, arrogance, hypocrisy, vanity, and exploitation. Los Capricios was not a commercial success. The Duchess of Alba's Architect made only one of very few existing contemporary responses. The Book of Witches and Satires by Goya. I didn't like it. It is very licentious. Perhaps Goya knew people were not ready for Los Capricios. He gave the plates and 240 printed copies to the Royal Calcography to avoid them being misused or confiscated by the Inquisition. Whilst working on Los Capricios, Goya continued to paint portraits. The 1790s saw his paintings evolve from works like this, from 1787, to portraits like this, from 1798. The earlier work shows us a portrait of Conde de Altamira, who appears swamped in scale by his furniture, which he does not believably sit upon. The colour and adornments of rank are regal, but little is conveyed with regard to his character. Whereas the later portrait ignites our imagination as we are introduced to the imposing figure of General Jose of Urrutia, a soldier who penetrated the ranks and rose to be field marshal without being a titled nobleman. His steely stare travels out from under a shadowed brow. His mouth is simultaneously tense in the teeth, but relaxed in the lip. The painting radiates the presence of personality most painters can only dream of capturing. But Goya will only produce works of such quality when he has uncovered something he is committed to convey. If we take this portrait of André de Perau from 1798 in the National Gallery's collection, we can clearly identify the elements that do not interest Goya. He is not bothered too much with the background, or worried about accurately or convincingly painting the sitter's clothes, which are described in sparse strokes. It seems Goya was most intent on capturing the strange curve of the sitter's lip, the beginnings of a slight snarl, an unusual feature that gives the portrait its presence. Goya begins to pick out and paint what intrigues him the most. Parts of the subject that remain outside his fascination are described in the most economic terms, and if nothing catches his interest, he will not produce a good painting. This aspect of Goya's creative personality was well known to his patrons. One wrote, "I've got to have my portrait. I want Goya to do it. It won't just be a hasty horror, but the way Goya can do it when he really wants to." This portrait of Josefa Castilla from 1804 is perhaps a product of Goya's unengaged eye. She is set against a plain background. The only colour comes from the red bed on which she is perched, the pink of her cheeks and the yellow of her hair. She appears awkward in her pregnancy and somehow a bit dim. This is not a dynamic portrait, and I wonder how she felt when the canvas was turned and her likeness revealed. It is true Goya painted those he knew and admired with a zeal absent from more straightforward commissioned portraits. Here he rapidly captures the exasperation of his friend and statesman, Gaspar Menchor de Jolovenes, a progressive mind within a restrictive political regime. But Goya also captures the ghost of his sitters. This haunting and hypnotic portrait of Manuel, the son of the Count and Countess of Altamira, is unforgettable. It is one of those works that burns onto your retina and into your soul. If you are lucky enough to come across it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection in New York, your heart skips a beat. Your eyes desperately try to catch up as they attempt to take in all the painting has to offer. The three cats about to pounce. The magpie seemingly unaware. The artist's signature in its beak. The caged goldfinch. The little boy. Detached, motionless, vulnerable. The effect is lonesome, melancholic, chilling, dangerous, and astonishingly beautiful. The textures of lace, satin, string, soft brushed hair, and alabaster skin are described beneath an eerie and unreal light, which seems to radiate from the back of the child's head. The colour is an exchange of red and green, continued into the dusty pink floor and grey-green wall, complementary hues rarely used to such effect. The Duke and Duchess of Osuna and their children was painted at a similar time, in 1787 to 88. It has a hollow quality that one can only ascribe to Goya. The figures are porcelain, yet alive. They are otherworldly, yet possess a relatable presence of mind. The streak of green shadow that fades to ominous black instills the uneasy quality Goya relentlessly entertains. Opposing green and reds again mark out territories of form. The boy's garments, a particularly beautiful episode. Goya, like his word, does not look to perspective or geometry to guide his ideas. He responds to his subject, but also to the painting itself. The works clearly evolve upon the canvas. Ideas reveal themselves through production. They are not drawn up and executed in accordance with a determined design. Goya responds to his subject. He responds to his paint. Great artists simultaneously serve multiple subjects upon one canvas. If it is hard to identify the subject of a work, then you know you are looking at a good work. The most famous of Spanish families was also cemented into paint by Goya in 1800. The family of Carlos IV is Goya's largest official group portrait, measuring 280 by 336 centimeters across. It shows the royal family, with Queen Maria Luisa in the middle, surrounded by her children, and Carlos IV to the right, with his brother and other family members behind. Goya appears to the left in the shadows as he works at his canvas. There are, of course, clear links to Velázquez's Las Meninas from 1656. But whereas Velázquez was painting the royal family from the eyeline of Philip IV and his queen, who have just entered the chamber and whose reflection can be recognized in the mirror on the back wall, Goya's family group appear as though they are looking in a mirror themselves. Goya has managed to capture the self-conscious and unnatural act of posing. When observing someone who is looking in a mirror, they often pull the most unusual faces. Some tilt their head forwards in order to avoid seeing any extra chins. Some narrow their eyes and pout their lips. Some lower their heads and widen their eyes. Just think of any selfies you've seen. The family of Carlos IV are also attempting to give off the right image, although Goya somewhat disrupts this. Queen Maria Luisa is placed in the middle, quietly giving her a greater sense of power than the king, who, although steps forward, does not radiate the glory of one who has been chosen by God to rule the Kingdom of Spain. Maria Luisa was said to wear the trousers in the relationship. She had influence over the king, who was seen as weak and rather dim by the people of Spain, who, as mentioned earlier, believed she was having an affair with the Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy. Nevertheless, the family are making a united effort to convey regal power, but Goya denies them the appearance of divine dignity and instead reveals their humanity, showing them to be afflicted by the same faults and insecurities as us. However, Goya has been careful to not go too far. His tracks are covered by the elegance of his brush. The surface is Goya at his most energetic. The brush rushes across the canvas, distributing economic yet expertly placed touches that captures the play of light on the rich fabrics. The glittering gold of the Queen's dress and the glint of the King's regal honours do just enough to distract and please the eye that looks for flattery. It also shows the glamour of royalty and its ability to bedazzle the commoner and the subject. Your attention is drawn away from the pursed lips of Maria Luisa, the round, ruddy complexion of the king, and the signs of boredom that creep in and colour the faces with a glassy, blank stare. Goya is the only figure you feel is actually looking at us, perhaps because he is looking to observe, whereas all others are looking whilst being observed. There is also a lack of relationship between the sitters, probably a product of process, as each figure was copied and pasted into the canvas. The surrounding works in the Prado show Goya's preparatory sketches for his subject's head, which were later transferred and arranged across the painting. Goya is not only portraying his subject, he is also describing the process of painting. He considers the act of posing an important part of the work, which distinguishes it from other paintings of the time. Vicente Lopez's Carlos IV's family from 1802 possesses all the ceremonial pomp and allegory that often saturated royal portraits. He uses his brush to flatter and cultivate the sitter's image in terms of political gain. Lopez's work glows with the sheen of a modern-day airbrush, whereas Goya's painting conveys the awkwardness of a family whose future is uncertain. Since the mid-17th century, the idea of divine authority was beginning to be questioned throughout Europe. The philosophical movement that came to be known as the Enlightenment promoted scientific thought and intellectual discussion above superstition, and no longer tolerated the abuses of power committed by the church and state. For the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, enlightenment was mankind's final coming of age, the emancipation of the human consciousness from an immature state of ignorance. The French Revolution saw the absolute monarchy that had ruled France for centuries collapse within 3 years. The old ideas about tradition and hierarchy regarding monarchs, aristocrats, and the Catholic Church were abruptly overthrown by the new principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, violent struggles for power followed. By 1804, Napoleon was instated as Emperor of the French. By 1808, he had invaded much of Europe, and Spain was next on his list. Napoleon assembled the most prominent members of the Spanish royal family on French soil and forced them to give up the crown. He ordered for the rest to be taken across the border to Bayonne. Word of their impending exile leaked out to the people of Madrid, who were already furious at the absence of their sovereigns. Multiplied by 1,000 mouths, the rumors of French deception spread throughout Madrid. As the last of the Spanish royals were seen departing for France, the Spanish exploded in revolt. These scenes are captured in two of Goya's most celebrated works, the 2nd and the 3rd of May, painted in 1814. But before I discuss these paintings, I want to talk about Goya's works that preceded these images and recorded the horror that followed these events. The war against Napoleon engulfed the whole country. He had hoped for a peaceful surrender and believed that, like Italy and other nations of Europe, Spain had an educated middle class, open to liberal assumptions, and would be supportive of the nation's move away from Spanish absolutism. This was not the case. Spain had no such enlightened middle class. The majority of Spaniards saw Napoleon as an oppressor. He had not anticipated the strength of the patriotic spirit that united the Spanish people against his armies. This was the first time guerrilla warfare was encountered, which in Spanish translates as little war. This describes the struggle between bands of irregulars or armed civilians who spontaneously grouped together against a formal state army. The church in Spain was massively opposed to Napoleon. It had whipped up a frenzied patriotic fervour amongst the people, igniting them into battle. The courage of Spain was sustained by a blind nationalism. They were prepared to fight the French in whichever way they could. For occupying forces, used to the idea of war as a series of formal battles, it was exceedingly demoralizing to survive on a territory where nearly anyone, not just uniformed soldiers, could strike at you from behind trees and vanish back into them, where every civilian had a knife concealed up their sleeve. The French were continually under threat from a highly unpredictable guerrilla army. The living nightmare of this confused and bloody war that lasted from 1808 to 1814 and was recorded by Goya in his series of 82 prints, The Disasters of War. The Spanish employed horror tactics on the French in order to psychologically break them down. They would mutilate the bodies of the dead and display them for the French to see, and in return, the French repaid the favour, making for an incredibly unpleasant war. It is unclear whether or not Goya witnessed any action, but it is highly likely he saw the horrific aftermath of violence and was aware of endless stories of torture and bloodshed during his travels outside Madrid to places such as Zaragoza, which was twice under siege. Goya does not flinch from the truth. Nothing is glossed over. Each terrifying reality is confronted head-on. This is They Do Not Want To, plate 9. Nor do these, plate 10. And neither do these, plate 11. The savagery of the images almost prevents you from appreciating their greatness in terms of light and composition. Goya is able to maintain his artistic composure. His emotions do not hijack the marks of his etching needle. In this, the last of 3 consecutive scenes of rape, the diagonal line created by the soldier and his victim that he drags across the floor, away from her baby dropped at her feet, beautifully conflicts with the arch of light behind. Its shape falls into the soldier's sword, creating a soft S. The action is always in the central band of the plate, usually running horizontally against the land and often building towards the shape of a pyramid, seen here in What Courage, plate 7, and There Isn't Time Now, plate 19. In The Same Everywhere, plate 23, the landscape and bodies are drawn as one. Their form is confused by the delicate line of Goya's hand. You're unsure if more of the dead lie outside the cave, or if it is the continuation of the rocky terrain. Inside, a hand sprouts up from behind a boulder, curled and erect with rigor mortis. If you see the dark kind of shape on the bottom left-hand corner, and you make your way just to the right, you should be able to see it. The line of the drawing is so calm and considered, it captures the hairs on the victim's head, the beauty of its execution in such stark contrast to the horror it describes. The prints are neither pro-Spanish or pro-French. In Rabble, the barbarity of the Spanish mob is described as a woman beats a seemingly lifeless body that has been dragged through the dirt. Another man prepares to shove a stake into the victim's anus. He has no uniform, so we can assume it is a civilian French sympathizer or one of the enlightened and French ganados, hated by the Spanish peasantry. The unbiased nature of these images is part of their brilliance. Goya has no doubt, and leaves us none, that the patriots can be as brutal, sadistic, and depraved as the invaders. He leaves open the question of who are the murderers and who are the victims. This is Bury Them and Keep Quiet. The dead wear no uniforms that identify them. Our pity is not guided to one side or another. We just imagine the stench and the bodies wasted in war. The only consistent victim is the landscape. It is forced to host the violence that riddles its hills and villages and receive the afflictions that leave it barren. This is worse, plate 37. The trees are stumps turned into gallows or racks to prop human bodies on. Goya never depicts buildings. The landscape is broken down into its simplest parts: a band of earth, a hill, a dark opaque sky, a rock. The settings are always ambiguous, the shadows looming and abstract. It could be any time, any place. When you turn the pages of the disasters of war, your gut flinches in the same way it can when we look at contemporary images of war, such as this one by Eddie Adams. Goya has created his own camera can't lie pictorial journalism long before the invention of photography. He is helpless to obstruct the atrocities he sees. The title of plate 44, I Saw It, refers to Goya's presence at the scene of brutality about to be inflicted. We are confronted by the terror of the unseen. Approaching just out of shot as civilians flee, we see a mother struggling to move fast enough as she reaches for her toddler, her baby, over her shoulder. This is what you were born for, plate 12. Goya drives home the fact that there is nothing noble about war. People live all those years filled with the experience of life that lead to a day when you are just another body on the ground. There are no triumphs. He reveals the grim face of war, stripped of all chivalry, romance, and idealism. Goya has created the kind of illusion that is only employed by truth. Truth is universal. It gives the works a modernity that is never exhausted. The Disasters of War was never published in Goya's lifetime. This would happen 50 years after it was conceived in 1863. Goya had already drawn the unwanted attention of the Inquisition, and he would be a fool to do so again. In 1814, the war was finally over, and at nearly 70 years old, Goya was commissioned to paint two works to coincide with the return of Ferdinand VII, who had been reinstated as King of Spain. The 2nd and 3rd of May record the uprising of the common Spanish people against the French, and the 3rd of May, the subsequent executions of those who took part in the revolt. The 2nd of May delivers something visually spectacular, the clash between two clearly identified sides, the French and exotic-looking Mamelukes from Egypt who fight alongside them, and the Spanish civilians who are on foot and armed with whatever they could find. The action is frenzied and chaotic. Like wild animals pushed to their limit, they show savagery to be the true state of nature. The French and allied Mamelukes look in terror as they are attacked from every side. A comrade has been dragged from his mount and hysterically set upon by the wide-eyed Spaniard. The horses anxiously look to their kind as one of them is slayed by the man crouching to the right. The globe-like backside of the horse he punctures is at the centre of the composition. It forms the bottom of a column of action as the billowing red trousers hug the marble-like curve of the horse. The orange dress of another Mameluke leads us to his dagger that points us back down to the bloody assault. The tail of the horse is removed, perhaps hacked off or erased by Goya, who feels no pressure to include details that might derail his intention to convey the explosive emotion of this scene. Unaided by the army or any notable Spaniard, the common people of Spain defend their country with such blind patriotic courage, only to be rounded up and mown down by the machine-like force of the French army. The 3rd of May shows how those who are alive with the passion of revolt in the 2nd of May meet their inevitable end. Multiple reactions and preparations for death flicker across the canvas. The figure left of centre has his fists in his mouth. You can almost hear his sharp intake of breath as he forces his eyes to the face of his executioners. Many cannot look at all. The monk looks to the ground in prayer, a figure seen through the ends of the guns, his hands clawing at his head in the hopeless horror as the soldiers repeatedly rehearse his death. 2 are defiant. One has the head up, eyes wide open. He glares down the barrels of the guns. The other has his arms outstretched. His helpless expression leads us to believe he has come to terms with his imminent death. Art historian Robert Hughes describes the collection of people as one of the most vivid human presences in all art. Goya pulls all his experience of the war that followed this event into an image of what started the bloody conflict. He reuses parts of the compositions for the disasters of war in the 3rd of May. This is when one cannot look, and it can't be helped. Like his prints, these are not noble killings. The victims are helpless against the wall of soldiers that appear as an anonymous, detached, and systematic killing machine, the prototype for modern images of war. The light in the painting is spectacular. The sky is blank and pitch black. The white shirt and orange trousers of the main figure glow in the light from the huge lantern of Goya's invention. His body makes an iconic cross shape that alludes to Christ, as does the marks of stigmata on his hands. The figure on the floor mirrors his pose. It is the next snapshot of the man's life. The blood soaks into the canvas as it does the ground. The colour so intense. Its darker tone describes deeper pools that collect in small puddles in the dirt. The marks are quick and instinctive. Each stroke is laden with emotion. Narrative is conveyed through the energy of the brush, rather than the illustration of the mark. This is not a commemorative painting. This shows how ordinary people lost their lives. Alone and without the protection of the country they were desperately trying to defend. This is perhaps why the paintings were never publicly presented or hung after they were received by Ferdinand VII's restored regime. And judging by Goya's 1814 portrait of Ferdinand VII in an encampment, I think we know how Goya felt about the reinstated monarch. In 1819, at the age of 72, Goya moved into a 2-story house on the outskirts of Madrid. It was here that he made what have become known as the black paintings, because of their excessive use of dark tones. The works were removed from the walls of the house and transferred to canvas in the late 1870s, and now hang together in one large room in the Prado. Their effect is incredible, yet inconceivable. You are not sure what you are looking at. Before now, art guided your emotions. You had an idea of what the artist's intention and what they wanted you to think. Now, you are literally left in the dark. The themes that captivated Goya's imagination in Los Capricios and the disasters of war are revisited and reinterpreted in these astonishingly strange paintings. One cannot quite imagine the impact they must have had as decoration for the walls of a house that were previously covered with pleasant scenes of the landscape. Perhaps its picturesque decor was too much to bear for an artist who knew better, knew these rural idyllic settings were the scenes for so many horrific events. Fight to the Death with Clubs sees two figures beat each other's brains out. They are painted directly into the decorative landscape, which explains why its idyllic blue sky is at odds with the violence below. You get the sense that Goya approached the wall, brush in hand, and with no specific plan began ridding himself of these nightmarish images. Their appearance reveals and perhaps ease the trauma of his experience. Although it is irrelevant to look for specific meanings or narratives, or titles were added later, and there is no specific audience in mind. Yet the lack of spectator does nothing to dispel the enthusiasm of his brush. Goya wonderfully disfigures and abstracts the only audience he is likely to encounter, an assembly of strange figures that are fragmented by strokes of pale pink and beige that blot out their features, making them indistinguishable as human, animal, or witch. One of the most enigmatic of the works is the painting of a dog. It looks up, about to be swallowed by a huge wave or some kind of force of nature. Like the figure in the 3rd of May, it seems powerless in the face of its fate. It is one of those works you can never quite comprehend. Your eye searches, straining across the surface for meaning and certainty, but a definitive explanation is out of reach. The painting enchants, like a hypnotic fable, but the moral it supports is unclear. Goya is painting for himself. He probably never imagined these works would be seen by many others. Here he was, completely free to express what he wanted, no need to rationalize and organize his thoughts onto canvas in order to clearly communicate to others. Art is so often defined by identifying its intended audience, but often one doesn't exist. Goya has no interest in a viewer's response. Here, he is his own patron. His house was his context, and his mind the subject. Goya's influence was great. Artists such as Edward Manet, Pablo Picasso, and more recently the Chapman brothers have all reinterpreted his work. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec designed this cover for an 1893 print edition of The Disasters of War. Goya is an artist who depicts truth, not the kind of photorealist or idealized truth, but the essence of truth that comes from trusting your instinct and following your ideas without worrying about how you might be perceived. Some of his works might appear as clumsy or unrefined to those who prefer the smooth, classical forms of David. But rather than refine what has gone before, Goya uses the past as a template to rework, much like Jake and Dino's Chapman did when they used his Disaster of War series as a setting in which to add their own imagery. This is their Insult to Injury from 2003. Often described as the last of the old masters and the first of the modern painters, Goya, seen here in a self-portrait from 1795, straddles a time when painting is no longer just a didactic illusion confined to the illustration of a person, story, or event. Painting is free to transcend emotion in other ways, where the painting itself becomes the subject. The black paintings are an early example of art for art's sake. There were probably many other artists who also produced works that are now lost, but could be identified as so. But I think the black paintings and those that led to their construction are some of the most astonishingly original examples of an artist's work. Goya reminds us to be courageous. Do not look to please, but look to learn. His curiosity of the capability of his own mind led him to the images he produced. He did not shy away from the brutal and terrifying image his imagination and memory conjured up from experience. He embraced the darkness, which could not be spoken. It could only be seen. As he said, I saw it.